On a beautiful summer morning in 1951, landlord Pansy Carpenter received a telegram from one of her tenants. Eager to make sure she got the message, Pansy hurried to Mary Reeser's unit around 8 a.m. She knocked on Mary's door, but no one came. She knocked again and still nothing. Mary lived alone and Pansy was sure that she would be home. After all, the woman was 67 years old and a widow. She was always home. So she tried the door handle to see if she could peek in and get Mary's attention. To Pansy's shock, the metal door handle was hot. Almost so hot she couldn't touch it. Pansy called the police, suspecting a fire. When firefighters would arrive a few minutes later, the scene that they stepped into in Mary's 1200 Cherry Street apartment in St. Petersburg, Florida would baffle the world, and Mary's case would remain a mystery to this day. Hey humans, it's Hannah. Welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, I do videos on creepy and disturbing things. And today we are talking about the very bizarre case of Mary Reeser, a possible case of spontaneous human combustion. Quick break to thank our sponsor, and then we'll get right into it. Today's video is sponsored by Adam and Eve. They are this amazing company that have been in business for over 50 years. They are the best adult product website on the market, providing 24/7 customer service, discreet packaging, and 90-day no-hassle return guarantee. My favorite part about this company is that 20% of all of their profits go to help fight the spread of HIV all around the world. Go take a peek at their website for yourself and use my code HORRIBLE because Adam and Eve is offering all of my followers 50% off an item with free shipping in the US and Canada. Link will be in the description right below this video. Thank you again to Adam and Eve for supporting the channel, and let's get into the video. So unfortunately, there's not a lot of information about Mary Reeser herself. We know that she was born in Columbia, Pennsylvania on March 8th, 1884. She got married eventually to a man named Dr. Richard Reeser, and together they had one son. I think they had other children, but unfortunately the other children did not survive, so their only surviving child was also Dr. Richard Reeser. He was also born in Pennsylvania around 1910 or 1911. The other thing that we know about Mary Reeser is that she eventually also became a widow. Dr. Richard Reeser, her husband, eventually passed away and leaving her by herself. Being a widow with only one surviving child, as you can imagine, Mary lived a pretty quiet life. She was born and raised in Pennsylvania, had her family there, but a few years before she would pass away, she actually moved to Florida because that's where her son was currently living. With her husband gone, she wanted to be closer to her son, her grandchildren, and her daughter-in-law, so she moved to Florida. On July 1st, 1951, Dr. Richard Reeser, her son, would come and visit Mary in her tiny apartment. He was around 40 years old by this time, and like I said before, Mary was 67 years old. Her son would later recall that Mary had been anxious that day. She was planning this trip to Pennsylvania so that she could go visit her hometown and go visit her friends that were still living there. But for some reason, these plans were not set in stone. She didn't know at that point if she was really going to be able to go or not, and she was just very anxious and thinking about how disappointed she would be if the plan fell through. Anyway, her son spent some time with her that night, comforted her as she told him about how worried she was, but then eventually he had to go home, so he kissed his mother goodbye. Mary said goodbye to her son as well, but while he was still there, she popped 2 sleeping pills. And so her son saw her take these sleeping pills before he left. He left and Mary settled in for a quiet evening to herself. Tragically, it was the last time anyone would see Mary Reeser alive. The next morning, on July 2nd, 1951, around 8 a.m. in the morning, as we talked about at the very beginning, Pansy Carpenter, the landlord, went to Mary's apartment to deliver a telegram that had arrived for her. A very depressing detail about this story, although it doesn't have to do with the case itself, is that the telegram that Pansy, the landlord, was bringing Mary that morning was from her friend in Pennsylvania, and the telegram actually told Mary that their plans were all set to go, all the details were taken care of, and Mary could go ahead and come visit. So again, as we established, Pansy went ahead and tried touching Mary's doorknob. It was very hot to the touch. Pansy thought there was a fire, so she called the police station. Here's what they found when they entered Mary's apartment. They opened her door to find literally a pile of ashes. Mary's body, as well as the chair she had been sitting on when she passed, was almost completely cremated. All that was left of her body was her left foot with the slipper still on it, and the slipper was pretty well intact, her backbone, and her skull. One of the weirdest parts about this case is that Mary's skull had shrank very small. Some reports said to like the size of a teacup. In fire or extreme heat, skulls tend to expand, not shrink, and under very intense heat, sometimes rupture, or for lack of a better word, explode, but that's rare. So her body itself was in a very odd state, but as they looked around the room, things only got weirder. Plastic items around the room had lost their shape a little bit from the heat and had melted just a little. There was very few, but a couple signs of smoke stains, but other than that, her apartment seemed completely intact and untouched. I mean, there was a pile of newspaper next to the chair she was on that didn't even have so much as a scorch mark. It made absolutely no sense. If there had been an accidental fire in Mary's apartment, wouldn't it have spread everywhere and burned down her entire unit? How did it start and end with her? Investigators were simply perplexed. A few days later, on July 7th, the chief of police, J.R. Reichert, sent a box of evidence from the scene to none other than FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, hoping that they could provide a little extra help into this case because the local small police department was at a total loss. The box that they sent to the FBI had 6 little pellet objects, which they believed were Mary's teeth, glass fragments that were found in her ashes, a section of the rug, the slipper that had been found still on her left foot, and then of course they sent samples of the chair, the walls, the floor, stuff like that. Because of the fact that her body was so clearly destroyed by fire and the rest of her apartment was more or less intact except for a little smoke damage, it was alleged, and Mary Reeser's case is known to this day as a case of spontaneous human combustion. This rumor started spreading, and soon enough, Mary Reeser's case was on national news. If you don't know what spontaneous human combustion is, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a person that just bursts into flames out of nowhere without any external heat source or any known ignition. There's been a few alleged cases throughout time, and of course the possibility terrifies a lot of people. The thought that you could just be minding your own business and some inadvertent chemical reaction could brew inside of you and you could become a human fireball out of nowhere. But of course, scientists are skeptical that it's anything more than pseudoscience. In Mary's case, investigators easily ruled out a lightning strike as there was no storms that day. It was summertime. They ruled out electrical failure, and then they also ruled out an accelerant like gas or alcohol as they tested samples from the scene and couldn't find anything. The medical examiner and investigators did finally come to a conclusion about Mary's death, although they couldn't prove it for sure. I think they really did it so that there would be some closure on the case. You see, I didn't mention this before, but Mary was quite the smoker. And as we also talked about, she was known to take quite a few sleeping pills. So we know for a fact that she took at least 2 sleeping pills because her son watched her do this, but it's possible she took even more after he left. We won't know. She was enjoying an evening cigarette in her chair when it is likely that the sleeping pills made her too drowsy and she couldn't stay awake, and she fell asleep with the cigarette still in her hand. Her daughter-in-law would later say in 1991, the cigarette dropped to her lap. Her fat was the fuel that kept her burning. The floor was cement and the chair was by itself. There was nothing around her to burn. And this would make sense, right? The cigarette lit her nightgown on fire, and that heat split her skin, exposing her nightgown to the fat inside of her body. And of course, as we know, fat is pretty flammable. It's theorized that her fat was soaked up by the clothing, and that would have kept the fire going throughout the night, like wax and a candle. In fact, they have a name for this phenomenon, and it's called the wick effect, and it is often used as an explanation for cases of alleged spontaneous human combustion. Okay. So mystery solved then, right? Why are people even saying that Mary Reeser's case could be spontaneous human combustion when this other explanation makes way more sense, especially because we know she was a smoker? Well, the police department also asked an anthropologist by the name of Wilton M. Krogman. He was experienced in fire research and worked at the University of Pennsylvania, and they asked him to take a look at the case. Wilton would argue that this wick effect made no sense. He mostly argued this because her skull would not have shrunk the way it did if it was to the wick effect. Like we established, heat causes the skull to expand and sometimes rupture, not shrink. And then the other thing was that her body was essentially completely cremated. It would have taken several thousand degrees of heat over several hours to leave her body in that state, not simply a cigarette burning through her fat. It just didn't make any sense to him with all the fire deaths that he had seen, that her body would have been left in that particular state without the rest of her apartment burning down. I'll come back to that in just a minute with my own thoughts at the end. Mary's ashes were split into two parts. Half of them went to be buried by her husband in Pennsylvania, and the other half went to her son and his family. Other alleged cases of spontaneous human combustion have been documented throughout history. Here's a few examples. Margaret Hogan was an 89-year-old woman with a case very similar to Mary's. She was a widow. She was found also in ashes, except for both of her legs, in 1970 in Ireland. She did have a small coal fire burning in the home the night before, according to a neighbor, but subsequent investigations ruled it out as the cause of the fire. Next, we have a 73-year-old man named Henry Thomas, who was found burned to death in his home in South Wales in 1980. Again, only his skull was left and both legs from the point below the knees. Half of the chair he was on was also destroyed. And then most recently from 2010, a 76-year-old man named Michael Faraday, who also passed away in Ireland, was given the cause of death as spontaneous combustion by the coroner. There was also a fire going in his home, although it was unclear if this was what caught Michael on fire. Now, for my personal opinions on this, I personally doubt that this is really truly a thing. At least the spontaneous part of spontaneous human combustion. I think it's more likely that there's just this very rare time when people pass away by fire and we can't find the source of the fire. And because there's no obvious cause, so we basically just conclude, oh, well, they must have just spontaneously combusted. I think there's several similarities to the cases that we just listed that is very important to note. All of these examples we talked about all seem to be elderly people, or at least older people, and they all seem to live alone. Cigarettes seem like the most likely explanation to me, as it would be very difficult to find one cigarette butt in a pile of ashes like that, when the cigarette would probably be reduced to very fine ash as well. And that could explain why the source of these fires never seem to be found. I think most likely this is just a very rare but possible accident when an elderly person who lives alone is smoking and falls asleep. They drop the cigarette on themselves, or they just come into close contact with a fire source, such as a fireplace, and they accidentally catch themselves on fire, but they happen to land, or they happen to be in a place where the rest of the stuff in their apartment just doesn't ignite. The legs of these victims are often still intact. In Mary's case, one of her legs was intact, but still. This reinforces the theory of the wick effect that we talked about earlier, as by the time the fire gets to the legs, especially below the thighs, there's not enough fat for the fire to continue, so it often goes out. As for the arms, they're usually close enough to the torso where the fire is going, and so the arms are often, unfortunately, taken with the rest of the body. As for Mary's case, I suspect that her right leg was just in the right position to be caught in the fire as well, and her left leg was probably sticking out. As for the anthropologist suggesting that the fire could not have been hot enough to reduce Mary to that state, I guess I don't really understand that. I am definitely by no means am I a fire expert, but with just a quick Google search, they cremate people at around 1400 to 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. A fire pit reaches about 1600 degrees Fahrenheit, and a candle flame is also under 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. So assuming her body had been burned around that temperature, like around the temperature of a fire pit, how come she couldn't have been cremated, or mostly cremated? The only thing I really can't explain is why her skull shrank the way it did. I don't see this particular thing being mentioned in other spontaneous human combustion cases, or even the wick effect. So this almost makes me wonder if the spontaneous human combustion theory is even valid. So I looked up how they make shrunken heads, because you know some cultures do that, and I thought maybe that would explain it. But shrunken heads are made by completely taking out the skull and then reshaping the skin and other stuff into a head. So the only possible explanation I've read for this is that maybe it wasn't her skull that they found at all, and her skull had actually been reduced to a pile of ash, just like most of the rest of her body. What if what they thought was her skull was actually just a burnt piece of muscle from the back of her neck that got like scorched into a little ball? And for some reason, they thought it was her skull, even though they never actually recovered her skull like they thought. This would only be possible, of course, if the actual coroner, the one who studies bodies for a living, had no idea what a skull looked like and couldn't determine that a ball of muscle was not a skull. So this seems pretty unlikely, but I guess it's technically possible. That's the biggest part of this case for me. I'm not positive about the spontaneous human combustion thing, but I'm definitely also wary of this wick effect theory. The last theory that you'll also see floating around is that Mary was somehow murdered. What if somebody kidnapped her, killed her at a different location, burned her body to destroy the evidence, and then returned these remains to her apartment? That was actually my first thought before I read the details about this case, is that somebody must have been in that apartment with her and did this to her. And it would also explain why the rest of her apartment was not set ablaze. But if you think about it for just a moment, this seems even less likely than spontaneous human combustion. This would have to be somebody who not only took Mary, but also took her chair, took her away to kill and burn her up, and then return her remains and the chair to her apartment. And then this also doesn't explain the stuff in her home that was melted or the other smoke damage. There's no way that it was foul play, in the sense, at least there was no way somebody took her out of the apartment and then returned her. Is it possible somebody broke into her apartment and, you know, killed her and then tried to destroy the evidence that way, and it didn't set the whole apartment on fire? Again, this seems unlikely to me because I believe her door was locked when the landlord came to check. There was no sign that there was any foul play or a break-in or anything like that. So I don't know. I don't think that theory holds enough weight, but I guess again, it's possible. Still doesn't explain the shrunken skull. All right, guys, that is gonna be it for today. Please like the video just for the sake of helping the channel out. Let me know what you think about this case in the comments down below, and I will see you all next week. Don't forget the amazing Adam and Eve discount. The link will be below. Thank you to all my patrons. Shout out to Colin Holmes, Deck of Cards, Michelle Valdovinos, Tom L, JJ, Quasi Eli, Little Kittle Cat, Whimsicott Fan, Delta Wolf 776, Mitchell Schaefer-Meyer, Mike, Alice Paul, Dark-Sided Otter, Brittany Phillips, Willow Winchester, Amanda Klein, Bambi, Nianu Kiano, Momo Nyan, Philip J, and our newest Covey for your additional support.